Many viewers asked me to react to the channel Candyberry MD, and specifically this video called What Will Happen If You Eat Oatmeal Every Day? Shock answer. So I took a look at it, and as usual, we contacted the creator, and to his credit, Dr. Berry was more than happy to come on and chat about it. So we did. You're about to see it. Hopefully this is helpful for you guys, seeing this process in real time, comparing views, going over the evidence that those views are based on, all done respectfully. So here's our conversation. Enjoy. Thanks again for being willing to talk. I think
absolutely. I'm happy to be here with you.
Yeah, and just to reiterate kind of how we find ourselves sitting here face to face. Basically, I've gotten over the years, a lot of requests from viewers to comment on your content, to react to your content. And a couple of videos come up a lot. And one of the videos that comes up a lot is this video about oatmeal that you made some time ago. And so I took a look at it, agreed with some of it. Other ideas I found very surprising because they didn't match any of the evidence that I had seen. But before you do an in-depth dive, maybe I have missed something. So reached out to you, and here we are.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it'd be really interesting to go over some of the ideas in the video, and maybe you don't subscribe to those ideas anymore. Maybe you do. Either way, it's okay. I think it'll be an interesting exchange.
Yeah, I totally agree. And let me just say right off the bat, I really applaud you for doing this. So many of us get in our silos of what we believe and what we don't believe, and that makes the other side immediately the enemy. And I don't think like that at all, and I don't think you do either. I think what you and I are both trying to do is rediscover what a proper human diet actually is. And so I'm really thankful that you reached out and said, hey, let's have a discussion about this.
Love it. Yeah, so just to give an example, the first idea that you have in the video, I think we agree on. Essentially, you are kind of playfully putting down this idea that oats are a superfood or a perfect food, this excessive hype out there. I essentially agree with that. I think basically superfood is not a scientific term, it's a marketing term. When it's used out there, it's used to sell stuff. There's no such thing essentially as a superfood scientifically. So the demystifying of excessive hype around certain foods as being perfect or panaceas, I agree with that sentiment.
Yeah, and part of my video is in reaction to those videos that qualify oatmeal as some kind of superfood. It's just like, oh, this is just the best food in the world. There's no downside whatsoever. And so part of my video, as you know, is based on just the nutrition and how it affects people with diabetes. But then part of it is just kind of a slapback answer to the people who act like, overnight oats are the answer to every single thing. And in preparation for that video, I know you do a ton of prep for your videos. It's obvious. I actually looked into the anthropological record on oats. And before about 4,500 years ago, no human ever ate oats in any meaningful quantity. Never. They just didn't. They didn't have the technology to process them. And so it was considered a food for horses, basically, and other livestock. And then we did develop some in the Iron Age. It started to be food for the poorest of the poor. And so anybody who could afford to eat better would eat better. But if you couldn't afford to do better, then you would eat oats. And they came up with various ways of cooking them to decrease the phytic acid and the lectins and the oxalates and the avenin. And it became basically a fallback food or a starvation food for the poorest of the poor. And then Quaker came along I think it was 1877, and they started the Quaker Mill Company and started milling oats. And then later, I think 1900 and 1901, they started the Quaker Oats Company, where they kind of conglomerated a bunch of different companies into one big company and started really making oats in earnest. And even then, if you go back and read in the history, oats were still considered a food, a fallback food. If you couldn't afford bacon and eggs for breakfast or whatever, then you would eat oats, and that was better than starving. And I totally agree with that statement, that oats are always better than starvation. 100% agree. And then some of your viewers may already know, but PepsiCo bought Quaker Oats in 2001, I think. And so PepsiCo, they tend to buy foods that have very specific criteria. And I think it's telling that they decided to buy Quaker Oats at that time.
Just to touch on something that you said initially, that oats started to be, that the first evidence appears 4,500 years ago. There is a study out there going back 30,000 years for oats consumption. Now, the quantification is always difficult with paleoanthropological data, but that's the oldest one that I've seen is 30,000. And then for whole grains in general, 100K plus. For, I think sorghum is the oldest one that I've seen.
Right. And so that's exactly correct. And that's been found at one time in that one specific location, that there was some evidence that suggests that they were eating oats in some meaningful quantity. But there are a couple of anthropologists who have a problem with that study, saying that the oat residue could have shown up for many, many other reasons. But I'm happy to give you that humans in one location around the entire world ate oats at that time 30,000 give or take years ago.
Yeah.
But like you said, the quantification, that's hugely important, and oats were never eaten in any meaningful quantity, at least as far as the evidence, before about 4,500 years ago.
Yeah, the discussion about paleoanthropology and what our ancestors ate, I find it fascinating. I had a full, like a 1 hour long, 2-part interview with a professor of paleoanthropology who dedicated his entire career to studying ancestor diets. So I think it's fascinating, and researching for that was one of the most fun videos that I did. But
yeah, and I think it's not only fascinating, I think it's actually vital to truly understanding what human beings should be eating, because every other animal on the earth, every other mammalian species that we deal with, we know exactly what they should eat. We know exactly what they should avoid. It's not up for debate in the veterinary sciences, right? Cows eat grass. That's known. And so many people don't even think, even dietitians and doctors, they don't think about archaeology, anthropology, paleoanthropology. That doesn't even enter into their mind when they're saying, oh, you should eat a bowl of steel cut oats every morning for breakfast. It's a superfood. They have given zero thought. And so I love it that you understand that's obviously very important. If we're going to be having public opinions about what humans should eat and what they should avoid, we should probably look back into the past and see what have humans been eating the longest? What have they been eating for hundreds of thousands of years? What have they been eating for thousands of years? I think that's very important and very telling, because there's this principle in biology called adaptation. In evolutionary biology, and even just in biology, you adapt to something the more generations you're exposed to it. And so there are certain foods that we've been eating, our ancestors have been eating for over 2.5 million years. And so obviously we have adapted thoroughly and completely to that, not only to the point where we can tolerate it, but that it actually is beneficial. And then there are other foods, and in my opinion, oats would be one of those. We've only been eating that for just a few hundred generations. And then predominantly the poorest of the poor who were eating that, and they often didn't reproduce. And so I don't think when we look at the history of oats, we get a really strong signal that they are, obviously we both agree they're not a superfood. We can both agree on that right now, I think. But then I have problems with oats being part of most people's regular diet, especially people with prediabetes, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, obesity, fatty liver. I think in those situations, you probably should not eat oats unless you love them, and then maybe have a bowl for your birthday.
So hopefully we're going to touch on several of these aspects and go over evidence on some of these questions. Just to kind of wrap up the ancestor part, my view is a little different. I think looking at what our ancestors ate is hypothesis generating. It's a very interesting thing to research. I think we can ask questions based on it. Okay, it seems like our ancestors ate X, so maybe this is a food that has a certain health outcome. I think that is not a conclusion, that is just a departure point that we then test with actual human beings, modern human beings, with the foods that we have available, and we observe what the health effects are, documented and with statistics and with everything. So
I think that's a valid point. I would tweak that just a little bit. Would you suggest that the statement cows should eat grass, is that just a hypothesis generating statement, or do we have has that experiment been conducted for enough millions of years that we can probably conclude without lots of new modern nutrition research that cows should eat grass? I think evolution, which is the ultimate long-term controlled experiment, there is no longer term experiment than evolution. I think we can conclude cows should eat grass. And I think that'd be very hard to try to defend the opposite point of that. But I take your point.
Yeah, so just to address that real quick, and then hopefully we'll get into the specific health issues. One difficulty establishing the parallel is that, for example, in the interview that I had with a paleoanthropologist, one point that he made repeatedly is uncertainty in the record. So there are enormous gaps of knowledge in the paleoanthropological record in terms of ancestor diets. Another point he made very insistently was diversity, that our ancestors ate an enormous diversity of foods depending on what they had available. And so I think this is something that most people agree on, that we are able to survive on a variety of diets. And so then the question becomes kind of optimal. What is optimal? What reduces risk factors for chronic disease and for the main killers of our society? And that is where I think looking at ancestor diets is weakest, is in terms of predicting higher or lower risk of chronic diseases, which arguably is the main concern for Westerners that have survival kind of guaranteed.
Yeah, and I think your guess that you're referring to was exactly right. That we are omnivores. There's no doubt about that. We have always eaten whatever we need to eat to not starve to death. But there are a few foods that are ubiquitous in every single time, every single culture that we've looked at. There are certain few foods that there is always evidence, yes, the humans were eating that. And that food would be meat. I don't know of a single study in anthropology or paleoanthropology where they didn't find stable isotope analysis that the humans were eating meat. Now, there are many studies where it's clear that they were not eating C3 plants at all. Others, they were not eating C4 plants at all. But in every single study that I've ever read, and I'm happy to be proven wrong, I've never seen a paleoanthropological study looking at stable isotope analysis where there was not obvious evidence that our ancestors were eating meat or seafood at that time. And you may know of studies I don't know about, but I've dug pretty deep and I can't find a study that does not show that they were clearly eating meat, including seafood.
Yeah, I don't think it's controversial at all that our ancestors ate whatever animals they could find, they would eat. And whatever edible things they could find that were nourishing, they would eat. I don't think that's controversial at all. I think maybe,
but in the same vein, there are many of those studies that show that they were clearly not eating these vegetables or not eating these plants, the C3 and C4 plants, the way they photosynthesize, that you can actually see that in the stable isotope analysis. And so I think that very commonly it's painted, oh, we've always eaten this rainbow of things. And it's like, no, we've always eaten meat and then whatever plants that we could digest, whatever plants were available. But without exception, we were always eating meat.
Yeah, I think the biggest divergence here would be, what would our ancestor diets tell us about the health effect of foods? My view is that they tell us relatively little in terms of long-term health effects of eating different foods. And I think with going over the specifics and the data, for example, on oats, we'll address some of these questions. So if we get into one of the first questions that you brought up in your video that I found surprising was talking about spikes, the glucose spikes and the insulin spikes, which is interesting to talk about because there are so many questions about this nowadays. And so the idea very briefly was that you're definitely going to notice if you start eating oatmeal every day is a big spike in your blood sugar and your insulin. Both of these are going to cause problems in your body.
So one thing you're definitely going to notice when you start eating oatmeal every day is a big spike in your blood sugar and a matching spike in your insulin levels. Both of these are going to cause problems in your body.
So I don't know if I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I don't know if you're still subscribed to this. What are your views on that?
Yeah, I think for a significant percentage of people, if they have a big bowl of oatmeal for breakfast, and this can be either steel cut oats or the processed quick oats, or just the highly processed flavored oats like the maple honey syrup oats, you're going to have a significant blood sugar spike. And I will freely admit that there is a subset of the human population that it's going to be not going to be a meaningful blood sugar spike. I think that's absolutely true. If you're young and very muscular and very metabolically healthy and very active, you can eat a bowl of oatmeal, especially steel cut oats, with no banana, no maple syrup, no sugar, none of that stuff. And you'll have a blood sugar elevation, but it's not going to be meaningful for you. If you watch much on my channel, you realize that I talk to metabolically ill people. That's my biggest listener base. And so people with prediabetes, people with type 2 diabetes, type 1 diabetes, people with hypertension, metabolic syndrome, hypertriglyceridemia, fatty liver, obesity, severe obesity. That's the audience that I'm talking to. And so for those people, and let me just say, Gil, initially, early in my medical practice, I believed what I don't, you haven't stated your belief, but I believe that you believe that oats they're a fine breakfast. They got fiber, they've got a little bit of protein, they've got a tiny bit of unsaturated fat, they've got some vitamins and minerals in them, although I would argue that many people don't have access to those because of the anti-nutrients in the oats. But I just thought, yeah, oats are fine, just don't put a ton of sugar on it. And but I have come to change that belief as I have practiced through the decades, and then also as I delved into modern nutrition research, and then especially when I started looking at the archaeology and anthropology. So yeah, I believe there's a significant portion of let's just say the U.S. adult population, let's just keep it at that, so that we've got a population of people we can talk about. I would opine that 88% of the U.S. population should not eat oatmeal regularly as a breakfast because they already have at least one marker of metabolic syndrome. And so they are going to have a much bigger blood sugar spike and then a subsequent insulin spike, because that's how human physiology works. And that is going to cause glycation to cells and tissues that is detrimental to health. And so does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just trying to organize because there were a lot of points. So one key distinction here is between someone who's not diabetic, who's healthy, who's physically active, lean, or reasonably healthy. We could use our example maybe, or someone like me, or whatever it makes sense, or like you, or whatever makes sense. Another kind of world would be someone with type 2 diabetes, where I think different dietary strategies make sense, and we can talk about that specific scenario. So I think it makes sense to separate this. The reason that your statement, and in general the video, I found surprising, is because all of these statements in the video, or virtually all, were very categorical. I don't remember any of these statements saying, if you have type 2 diabetes, then here are some concerns, and here's some way you can tailor your diet. In general, the statements were, you are definitely going to see this. You are going to have problems. Your blood pressure is going to spike. You're going to get fat on oatmeal. That's what I found most surprising. I can explain my reasoning behind that.
Most young, healthy, fit, muscular people who don't have metabolic disease aren't doing YouTube searches, is oatmeal good for me or not? Right. And so I tend to try to make videos that people are searching for. And so people with metabolic syndrome and other metabolic diseases, they are much more likely to type into the YouTube search engine, is oatmeal good for me or not? And so, yeah, there are some categorical statements in that video. And that's because I assume that if anybody's watching a video about is oatmeal good for me or not, they probably have a few markers of metabolic syndrome. And therefore, they probably fall into the category of people that we were talking about previously.
So I wondered about that. I wondered if this was just a kind of an internet compartmentalization, because in my channel, I don't have that experience. I have people from all walks of life, from people who are very healthy to people who are very sick. But I specifically wondered if this was the case. Maybe your audience, maybe you targeted to a certain audience and you didn't even bother to specify that you meant a certain population.
Yeah.
So,
and then also, Gil, you know as well as I do that there are millions of people, and we'll stick to U.S. adults. There are millions of U.S. adults who have undiagnosed prediabetes and undiagnosed type 2 diabetes and undiagnosed metabolic syndrome, correct? I mean, if you look at the epidemiology, even on the American Diabetes Association website, they'll admit there are millions of people with these conditions who are undiagnosed. So now we've got 88% of the adult U.S. population with at least one marker of metabolic syndrome, right? That's in the literature. And now we've got these millions of others, and this includes teenagers and young children as well, who have undiagnosed prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver, metabolic syndrome, and they're already overweight or obese. What's the percentage of that in teenagers now? It's pushing 50%. So I would argue that, what is it, maybe 3% of the U.S. adult population who shouldn't watch my video about oatmeal? It's a very low number, right?
So we'll get to the people with the metabolic issues and what specific dietary changes make sense there, because I think that's a specific discussion that makes sense. I just wanted to share on, as I was trying to get to this, because I wondered about this, if it was a population thing, if it was maybe the compartmentalization of your audience, I took a look at the reactions to the video. So for example, this person commented, I started eating oatmeal for breakfast 6 months ago. I add nuts and cinnamons and banana and a couple other things. I'm hardly hungry at all at lunch. My cholesterol is down. My A1C improved. My bowel movement is more regular. I feel better at 62 than at 32. Another guy said, for 60 years, I've been eating oatmeal every morning. I've never been sick. I'm slim with no medical problems. These were some of the top voted comments on your video. Among the top 5 or so comments, several were people who anecdotally were disagreeing with the message in the video. Now, of course, with anecdotes, we always have to be extremely careful and not assume cause and effect for any of these factors. But I was just wondering if this was something that it was an audience thing, but it seems that the viewers who watched this video found these comments to be among the most helpful and the ones they related to the most. So I suspect and I suggest for you to consider that many people are watching this video and ending up confused or surprised by the message. By the way, the other top comments were, I'm beginning to wonder what the hell I can eat. Doesn't matter what I eat. Doesn't matter what I eat. Somebody's bound to say it's bad for me. This video helped me tremendously, ... not to listen to strangers on the internet telling me oats are unhealthy. These are like the top 5 to 10 comments were all like this. Or, let's say 2 out of 3. And
that video has what, 11,000 comments?
Yeah, but these are the top voted by your viewers. So that's
right.
So I wasn't sure about this either. So that's why I looked at the reactions of the viewers themselves, because I didn't want to be like, I might be coming from a point of view of a a priori belief. But I think it's defensible that the viewers of that video are in a substantial proportion disagreeing or finding this message surprising or objectionable. Now, I get that. I do make YouTube videos too. We get lots of comments and lots of strange things that people say. I'm just bringing up the possibility that making these categorical statements, but really meaning people with specific conditions, might confuse a lot of people. But I don't mean this.
No, I understand, and I take your point. The majority of my views come from the United States, even though I have a large viewership in India and Australia and other places. So if we go back to the current state of metabolic health for U.S. adults, if 88% of people have at least one marker of metabolic syndrome, so we know now that leaves only 12%. And then we also know from the research that there are millions more who have undiagnosed metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, prediabetes, hypertension, fatty liver, obesity. What would be just your educated guess as to what percent of the U.S. population, if we were able to magically do an A1C, a lipid panel, and a fasting insulin on every single adult human in America, what percentage of U.S. adults do you think are perfectly metabolically healthy? They don't have a single one of those things, either diagnosed or undiagnosed. What percentage would your educated guess? What would it be?
Oh, we have estimations in the U.S. Perfect health without a single marker of metabolic syndrome. It's a very small percentage. It's less than 10%. But I would disagree with the premise of that question. The implication there, and we haven't gotten to that, so we'll get to the actual facts. But while I agree that oatmeal or the absence thereof can be personalized for some of those conditions, like type 2 diabetes, we'll get to that in a second. For several of these markers of metabolic syndrome, not only don't think that oatmeal is necessarily problematic, but I think we're going to go over evidence that it can be, in some settings, I'm not trying to make blanket statements, but in some settings,
Sure.
beneficial, specifically for people with some of those conditions. So we're going to go over the data, so it's not just me spouting opinions.
Yep. Sure.
But so to touch on the type 2 diabetes population specifically, and then we'll come back to the spikes, which I think is really interesting. I think it's completely reasonable in a population, someone with type 2 diabetes, to moderate or time out the foods that cause an abnormal glucose response. So in fact, I've done this in my own family, even people who had, for example, who were diabetic induced by medication, for example. They started a new immunosuppressant drug, became hyperglycemic essentially overnight, massive abnormal response to oats and some other foods. And in fact, we timed out those foods. A couple months later, switched back the meds, normal glycemic again, went back to eating oatmeal with a completely normal glucose response. So I think that's a very reasonable strategy. The nuance there, or the additional thing to mention, is that for most people in the US, in the West, the root cause of diabetes is not going to be medication. For some it is, but the majority, it's going to be an excessive visceral fat, an excessive adiposity causing insulin resistance, and then eventually diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And
I know that's one of the prevailing hypotheses, but that's obviously never been proven to the point, never even been supported to the point where that's actually a theory. That's still one of the many hypotheses of what causes diabetes. Isn't that correct?
no, it's the most supported by far idea in terms of pathoetiology of diabetes. Roy Taylor is the guy who conducted a lot of the research. So if you look at weight loss studies, pretty much on any diet under the sun, from low carb to high carb and everything in between, you can put diabetes in remission, improve metrics of insulin resistance, as long as there's weight loss. So this has been shown.
I agree.
Right.
Yeah, but I don't think it's ever been shown that it's actually the weight loss itself that is reversing the type 2 diabetes. I don't think we've ever seen the causal mechanism or link there. And thus why I said it's a very popular hypothesis, and it probably has consensus support from all the experts. But I don't personally believe that, and we can go into why I don't believe that. It comes from my 22 years of practicing family medicine and what I've actually seen in the trenches for 22 years as to why I don't believe that's the case. But yeah, I agree. That's a very popular hypothesis of what causes type 2 diabetes, but I don't believe it's correct.
Okay, it can certainly be uncoupled from macronutrient composition because you can put diabetes in remission on a variety of macronutrient compositions. I think there are factors, for example, caloric intake. We can't really uncouple caloric intake from excess adiposity. It's very difficult. So yes, it could be the chronic energetic excess, or it could be the adiposity itself, or a mix of the two. I guess those two tend to be causal anyway. So, but yeah, if we get into the details, it could be either of those two. Yeah. But I think we have a lot of evidence that it's not any specific macronutrient. We could get into that, but
then we always, as a practicing physician, I have to always come back to the question, okay, how do we diagnose diabetes? We diagnose diabetes based on an elevated blood glucose reading or an elevated hemoglobin A1C, which is a record of chronically elevated blood glucose.
right.
We can also do a 2-hour glucose tolerance test, which again is looking at elevated levels of glucose in the blood.
Yeah.
And so that's the definition of diabetes, type 2 diabetes. That's how we define it. That's how we diagnose it. So I guess it feels a little bit odd to say, well, it's about calories and adiposity. Well, it's a blood sugar excursions and blood sugar being constantly elevated to the point where it's damaging your body. And so if there is a food like oatmeal that causes a significant blood glucose excursion, then that's probably not good for you. I think that's common sense. And then regardless of your current, BMI or your current any other measurement, if you are metabolically unwell, you do not want to eat any food that causes a significant blood sugar excursion and increases your rate of glycation. That's the way I look at it. Now, that could be, you may disagree with that.
Not fundamentally. I think for people with type 2 diabetes, we've stated our positions, and I think we agree that ideally, I think it's a completely reasonable strategy to.
Now, what about the millions of people with pre-diabetes? Do you also agree with it in that context as well?
Yeah, if it causes foods that cause, same logic. Right. Foods that cause.
Okay, and then also, one more question. I'm sorry to interrupt. What about the millions of people with undiagnosed pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes? Would you also agree in that context as well?
Yeah, but if they're not diagnosed, how are they even going to be minding these things?
Well, that's right, but the glycation is still happening whether they're diagnosed or not, isn't it? If they have undiagnosed type 2 diabetes, they're going to have a huge blood sugar excursion from eating oatmeal, and that's going to cause glycation and permanent damage to every arteriole in their body, correct?
Yes.
The diagnosis is not magic. That's not when the damage begins. The damage begins usually years, if not a decade, before the diagnosis is made. And so basically my video is a preemptive warning to anybody who has any symptom or sign of metabolic syndrome. Oatmeal is probably not the best breakfast for you.
With metabolic syndrome, I disagree. We're going to go over the specifics like
okay.
But with type 2 diabetes, I think we essentially agree that it's a reasonable strategy. The only thing I would add there is that
pre-diabetes as well, right?
Pre-diabetes, yeah, same logic, yeah.
Okay.
The only thing I would add is that the key there, because weight loss and fat loss is the most consistent trigger of diabetes remission that we have in the literature, and because that can be achieved on a number of diets, and because we see the most consistent observation in these trials is that people lose weight on a variety of diets over 6 months, and then the majority of people put the weight back on and go back to being diabetic after a year or two. The key factor for me seems to be sustainability of the diet. And so different people, I think we have that experience, different people are going to find different diets sustainable and doable. I have viewers, for example, who say that a low-carb diet helps them maintain healthy body weight, and if they add carbs, they can't do it. I believe them. I have viewers who say the exact same thing about low-fat diets and who put their diabetes in remission on low-fat diets. And many others, I think statistically, we can say from trials, the majority of people over the long run have trouble sticking to either of those very, very kind of extreme restrictive diets. And maybe different diets like Mediterranean or other versions may be more sustainable long-term. So I just think that's important to bear in mind. But I agree that for someone with type 2 diabetes, like I've had cases in my own family, that in that interim, while the root cause is being addressed, it's a completely reasonable strategy to time out these foods that are causing an abnormal glucose response. We're going to get more into the specifics of metabolic syndrome because I think there it gets more interesting. Just
Yes.
wanted to bring up some things with glucose spikes. I think your, of course, abnormal glucose spikes in the context of diabetes. I think we both agree that's bad news. Glucose spikes in a normal individual. I never had diabetes. I eat some oatmeal. There's a glucose excursion. The body distributes that glucose. The glucose comes back down. Do you think that's a concern health-wise?
Well, it depends on how long the excursion is and how frequent these excursions occur. Wouldn't you agree? What does your personal blood sugar do when you eat a bowl of oatmeal? What's it go up to?
Goes up by 30, 40 something points. So maybe from 80 to 120 something, maybe ballpark.
Yeah.
And then
and so in your case, you're one of the rare people that probably can enjoy. Is that an oxymoron? Enjoy a bowl of oatmeal? I don't know, but I think you're someone who could eat a bowl of oatmeal and it's not consequential. But I think there's a large percentage of people that it is consequential. Anybody who eats a bowl of oatmeal and their blood sugar goes above 140, and granted, that's an arbitrary cutoff that medicine has been using for decades to say, whoop, that's too high, that's a problem. And I think you would agree as well as I do that to the degree that your blood sugar is elevated, you're going to be causing more glycation in your body. I think that's just a kind of a basic rule of physiology. I think the higher your blood sugar, the more you glycate. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. And so in your case, I think it's fine. Now, let me just give you a little background about me, because this might be relevant actually as to why I think like I do. I used to be severely obese. Back then we called it morbid obesity. My BMI was 32 and I was pre-diabetic. And that's kind of where I started as a family physician on this journey. It's like, crap, that's bad. I can't have that. And so basically in my reading to try to fix my own body, that's how I have come to everything I talked about in my YouTube videos. And so I'm someone, I haven't checked it lately, but I bet with a CGM, I bet my blood sugar would still go to 150, 160 if I eat a 1 cup serving, which is that's the classical serving you talk about of even steel cut oats. But I might do that here in the next few days just to see if I still, because you don't have much of an excursion. And I do know that you're correct that there are some people who previously were very type 2 diabetic, very metabolically sick, and had just an insane excursion when they would eat a bowl of oatmeal. But after they got healthier, lost some weight, got more metabolically healthy, they didn't have nearly as high of an excursion. That's absolutely, that makes perfect physiological sense.
Yeah, so we're going to touch on glycation because I think we have some difference of views there. Glycation, of course, with very high glucose levels, chronically, it causes hemoglobin A1C, glycation, but it doesn't seem to be linear. So I think there's just a slight difference there. It's not as simple as the higher the glucose, the more glycation there is. There might be a threshold at some point, but we'll go over the data on glycation if we have time.
Sure.
I just wanted to point out something you said specifically about the 140 cutoff. That's for 2-hour postprandial time point.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
Within a healthy individual, if my glucose goes higher than 140 at some point, I'm not worried about it. As long as by the 2-hour mark, I'm not at 140. So just I know you know this, but people at home, oftentimes this is.
Well, yeah, you're correct that's the 2-hour cutoff for a glucose tolerance test. But if that's abnormal 2 hours after a glucose load, which is typically 75 grams, then why would it not be abnormal in any other situation?
Because by that time point, the body has brought down the glucose to normal levels in a healthy individual. So that's a cutoff that you're not supposed to be that high 2 hours after. It's completely different 15 minutes or 30 minutes after, where you expect a glucose excursion after, for example, bowl of oatmeal.
Carbohydrates. Yeah,
Sure, depending on the glycemic index, but
sure.
I don't think my glucose goes up to 140 after a bowl of oatmeal. But if it did, I wouldn't be particularly worried about that either. But
Yeah,
at 2
and
hours, at
you're
2 hours,
probably supported.
yeah.
I'm sorry, but you're probably supported by the evidence and not worrying about that in your particular case. But I am worried about a blood glucose excursion above 140 at any time after ingestion of any meal. And so I don't think 140 becomes magically bad at 2 hours. And I understand your what you mean by saying, 2 hours later, if it's still high, then that's obviously a problem. But it's still glycating, even if it only goes up to 140 at the 30-minute mark and then starts to go back down. I think that from the research I've seen, and I'm happy to be shown wrong, the research that I've read, it's pretty much linear. And I think at the lower glucose levels, it's probably not as robust. But when you get above 130, 140, 150, I don't know of any research that shows that that's somehow not more glycating than a blood sugar of 90.
We'll go over the glycation data and the A1C data.
Sure.
Yeah, I think maybe we've seen different data because I have not seen data that glucose excursions in a healthy individual cause meaningful glycation or meaningful differences in A1C. But we'll go over that specifically.
Okay.
Just wanted to share something real quick that I found was interesting, but maybe we agreed on this already. You've heard probably that exercise causes glucose spikes as well, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So I was curious about this, and I was wondering if the magnitude was like a completely different range from diet, or if it was similar. So I pulled some traces.
There's two situations where you'll see kind of anomalous blood glucose excursions, and that's with intense exercise, but also with fasting. If you fast for a past 24 hours, you'll often see an elevation in blood glucose as well. But typically in those situations, you don't see it go above 140. And also there's a difference in the glucose and the body's need for glucose, because in a severe exercise situation, your body's actually releasing the stored glycogen, and in other ways, your body is making the glucose go up. Yeah. That glucose excursion is not being caused by what you ate. It's your body is demanding that glucose. And so I would opine in that situation that that's going to be much less glycating, because that glucose is not going to circulate for a long period of time. That glucose is going to be used immediately because some part of your body demanded that glucose, and your liver's happy to oblige in your muscles. And in the same respect, when you're doing a longer fast, a 1 day, 2 day, 3 day fast, your blood sugar might elevate, but that's because your body's demanding that. It's not that you've stuffed yourself with so many carbohydrates that your body can't help but have a blood sugar excursion.
So I think this curve might be interesting, specifically with regards to the idea that in the setting of exercise, the body takes up the glucose immediately, and in the setting of eating, it doesn't. So if I can share the screen real quick. Can you see those traces?
Yes, I see it.
Right. So the grain of salt, because this isn't publication quality, I took these 2 traces from separate studies. So grain of salt there. I was just curious if the range, if the magnitude was similar. So this is just over time glucose level changing. Just for fun, do you want to guess which one is exercise and which one is oatmeal?
Tell me which one is which.
The blue is exercise. It almost doesn't matter, because I'm sure if we repeated each curve, we'd get some variation there. So, here, I don't think one curve is obviously taller or longer than the other. I was just struck by their rough similarity in scale. Now, to be specific, just to give you the details, the exercise is a cardio, 15 minutes on a stationary bike, intense activity. So I just thought it was interesting that the curves are somewhat similar, and this doesn't.
The green curve is definitely from oatmeal.
Oatmeal, yeah, overnight oats, yeah.
Gotcha. And so in this person that this curve was taken from, neither of these gives them an excursion above 130.
Sure. Yeah.
So in this metabolically healthy person, I think that curve, that's exactly what it would look like. But you would probably agree that in somebody with metabolic illness, these curves would probably look significantly different.
It would definitely look different depending on the illness. But for example, diabetic person, the oatmeal curve would likely look very different. Not just the magnitude, but what's more important, the length of the curve. The curve
That's
would
right,
be out
and also in people with prediabetes as well. Correct.
Yeah, just not an extreme, but essentially, yeah. I don't know what the curve would look like for exercise for a diabetic person, but I think that data is out there. I just don't remember exactly. But so in this setting, it seems like we are agreeing in this setting, the glucose spike is not a problem. And then at some point, a glucose spike that is either very high, we may disagree on the exact cutoff, but a glucose spike that is extremely high or that is very long, like in the setting of diabetes, then that's bad news. It sounds like we're roughly on the same page.
Yeah, roughly, I agree.
Okay. So yeah, just go back to, because my whole thing went crazy when I did the screen share. Stop share. Okay. I just thought that was interesting, and I think a lot of people, you've probably seen this, but a lot of people will be surprised by these traces. Yeah.
And let me be very clear. I've checked blood glucoses in tens of thousands of people. And I have seen young metabolically healthy people who could literally drink a 16-ounce Pepsi, eat 4 jelly donuts and a bag of Doritos, and their blood sugar go to 110. I've seen that in young metabolically healthy people. Absolutely, there are people who can currently tolerate that. Now, I think we're blind to the fact that in those people, if you were also checking insulin levels, I think that you would find that they would be having a marked insulin excursion, which me and my colleagues would call a hyperinsulinemic event, which I think is also a problem for long-term health. But yeah, there are many people who are young and metabolically healthy who would have a curve that look like you showed on the screen, just eating pure, high ultra processed sugar junk food.
Yeah, and I think this is progress, and I think this is relevant information, because I do get questions from people who are being told or maybe understood that any change to their glucose level is pathological. That I think they associate this with diabetes, because in our minds, glucose goes up. We tend to associate this with, oh, I'm becoming diabetic. And so this is a question.
As we should associate it, because that's how you define and diagnose diabetes. But I agree with you that not every glucose excursion is pathology. I totally agree with that. With the obvious examples of intense exercise or prolonged fasting, you're going to have a blood sugar excursion. That's not pathology. That's physiology. I totally agree.
Yeah, and then I would add eating a food with carbohydrate, particularly food with whole carbohydrate, a whole food that causes a glucose excursion in a healthy person. I would classify that as completely normal physiology, not a concern. So I think we agree on that, and we also agree that at some point it becomes pathological, and the exact cutoff might be debatable. But I think this is, I think, very, very good, very interesting. So let's touch on glycation, because you brought that up several times.
Yes.
So hemoglobin A1C, I looked it up first in the setting of the oatmeal intake, just in general, and then some general trends with diet and hemoglobin A1C. I'll try to go over this quickly so it's not boring and too long a monologue.
Sure.
So the idea that you stated in the video was your high blood sugar from eating the oatmeal is going to start to glycate all of the cells in your body, and then you specifically refer to A1C.
Your high blood sugar from eating the oatmeal is going to start to glycate all the cells in your body. You may have heard of a test called a hemoglobin A1C.
So I looked at trials that measured A1C, randomized trials with or without oatmeal. Basically, depending on the trial, and there are quite a few, you either see no significant difference to A1C or a reduction of A1C on the oats, including trials looking at diabetic individuals. Now, one question is, what are the oats being compared to? Always a huge question in nutrition. So a few trials look at oats versus eggs, for example, which is an interesting comparison. We have a lot of these for things like blood pressure and body weight, a lot of those comparisons. For the A1C, one trial that I saw looked at that. They found no significant difference in A1C between oats and eggs. I would grain of salt there, not just because it's one trial, but because this trial, I have some concerns with the way they structured it. They added a bunch of other foods. So grain of salt. And so this is what I've seen. We looked pretty extensively. We couldn't find a single trial where hemoglobin A1C went up on the oats interventions. If you've seen one, I would love to look at it.
Yeah. Do you have a graphic of this? I didn't know if you were going to show. I didn't know if you. I thought you were going to show something. That's fine. Okay. No. Yeah, I got you.
Yeah, I can pull up and show like a forest plot or something, but no, I didn't have like a great image like
right,
that. Yeah. I wasn't going to make a point. Yeah.
Gotcha. So several points here. First of all, as you know, and I'm sure you readily agree, doing nutrition studies in human beings in the wild, so to speak, right, in their natural environment is just nigh impossible. In order to get the power that you need to say, yes, this actually showed that, in order to restrict their diets enough to know that you're not getting confounders, in order to control for all the other variables, it's just virtually impossible. And I mean, I've had multiple people who do nutrition research for a living on my channel for interviews who readily admit that. It's like, yeah, this is really the only way you can ever get meaningful nutrition research data is if you control every single variable. And you can't, and so a lot of these studies will say, oh, we controlled for obesity, we controlled for, smoking and this and lifestyle. But what people don't understand is that the way you control for that is you use a mathematical formula, which was basically, it's based on a model. And so we're like, okay, we think that this is going to control. And so we have no idea of knowing if that calculation in reality actually controls for that. And so there's like we could talk for 6 hours on the problems with modern human nutrition research. And so I'm actually glad you didn't have a graphic to show from that, because the first thing I would ask you is who paid for the study, because human nature being what it is, as well as I do that matters. Yeah. So the question was on the A1C. And so my biggest problem on YouTube is that I'm fighting against people who say things with authority, such as overnight oats that's it. That's gonna cure your diabetes. That's gonna reverse your diabetes. That's gonna make you lose weight. It's been shown in studies that it's gonna help you lose weight. It's gonna lower your A1C. But in real people, that's often not the case. And that's the majority of my audience is just real people who are just trying to say, okay, what should I eat for breakfast, dude? So that I can get my A1C down, get off these medications, reverse my type 2 diabetes. And so part of my video was in answer to that. No, oats are not a superfood. Also, oats in many, many people, and you said maybe 92% of people, and I would say we're probably pushing 95% of the U.S. adults, they're going to have a significant blood sugar excursion if they have a bowl of oatmeal. And then the other problem is that what many people hear when these influencers say you should eat oatmeal every day, not even that it's a superfood, but there's research that shows that it's going to lower your A1C, or there's research that shows that fiber is going to help you lose weight, right? What the average person who's not a nutritionist, who is not a nerd like you and me, who's reading 10 or 20 nutrition studies a day, they don't hear, okay, in a well-formulated diet with regular exercise, eating a normal serving size of steel cut oats without adding maple syrup or sugar, they don't hear that. What they hear is, oh, okay, oats are good. So I can eat oats. And so what they wind up doing is eating Quaker's strawberries and cream instant oatmeal, because oats are good. Or they wind up putting a bunch of honey or sugar or something like that in their oatmeal. because oats are just good prima facie. Oats are good. I can eat oats. And so they don't get the full picture. And so I'm happy that, look, I watched my video before we went live together. I'm happy that I was so really outspoken about the oats, because my main goal is to get people to think about their health and to think about the foods they eat. And so calling out oats, maybe a lot of people will actually take their box of Quaker strawberries and cream oats and turn it around and look at the nutrition facts and then say, holy crap, this is full of sugar. And then my answer to that would be, yeah, it is full of added sugar, but then also the majority of the carbohydrates in the oats are starch in the form of amylase and amylose and amylopectin, which are broken up immediately in your mouth into glucose or maltose before you even swallow the oatmeal. And then when you swallow it, your pancreatic amylase is going to break it down even further into it's literally just pure glucose. That's what the majority of the carbohydrates in oatmeal are. And so I love it when people start to think about that. And that's really my primary goal, because like I said earlier, when I was a young physician, I had no idea about all this stuff. If you'd asked me what enzyme breaks, the starch in oatmeal, I could have got amylase because I learned that, but I would have had no idea about the maltase and the other enzymes required to break down all of the amylose and amylopectin in oatmeal. I just wouldn't have known that, but now I do. And so many people just don't know that. But where I first started seeing a signal early in my medical career is when I would tell people, oh yeah, eat your oatmeal, put some bananas in it. And then they would come back in. And back then we didn't have CGMs. We just had the finger prick glucometer, right? And they would come back in and they would say, I tested this, and an hour after I ate that bowl of oatmeal, my blood sugar was 195. And then 2 hours after, it was still 150. And I was like, that's weird. Oatmeal has fiber in it. That doesn't make any sense. I don't understand. But it's this almost magical belief when you hear somebody that you respect say, oh, oatmeal is good. Oatmeal will help you lose weight. Oatmeal will lower your blood sugar. People they take you at your word. They don't realize that there's so much nuance. And that's why I'm such a huge fan now of continuous glucose monitors, because if somebody watching this right now thinks, I think Dr. Berry's full of shit, right? Or alternatively, I think Gil's full of shit, get a continuous glucose monitor, put it on, and eat that big bowl of oatmeal and watch what your blood sugar does. Does it go above 140? How long does it stay elevated? How long does it take for it to come back down? So if you watched any of my other videos, you know this. I'm a huge proponent. I want people to check and verify, because as you said earlier, there's young, healthy people who can probably eat a bowl of oatmeal and have no metabolic consequences whatsoever. But I would opine that 92% of adult Americans, in your estimation, 95% in my estimation, they are going to have a significant glucose excursion, which is going to cause unnecessary, unhealthy glycation. And so just like every other thing when it comes to human nutrition, it's complicated, right? That's the answer for virtually any question in human nutrition is it's complicated. But I just wanted you to understand my thinking and how I've progressed from being the guy back in 2003 who would be like, yeah, don't eat that instant oatmeal. You eat steel cut oats or rolled oats, because those are, the kind you have to cook for 3 days. Those are good for you. But I didn't realize back then that steel cut oats have exactly as much starch in them as the 1 minute oats. Now, the 1 minute oats have a little less fiber, right? And they're going to probably cause a higher blood sugar excursion because of that, but it has the same amount of sugar in it. And if you're metabolically unwell, it's going to spike your blood sugar and it's going to cause unhealthy glycation. Does that make sense?
I'll touch on a couple of the things, and I'll try not to be too long. Just a slight correction. When we said 90-something% of people are metabolically unhealthy, that does not mean that 90-something% of people are going to have a high glucose spike, an excessive or abnormal glucose spike. 95% would be anyone that has any of these metabolic syndrome factors, but some of these, as we'll cover, can actually be alleviated by oats. So I think people that we agree are going to have an abnormal glucose response would be people with diabetes, pre-diabetes, and there we're talking about 15, 20, 30% of the population, really.
So these numbers depend where we look. Worldwide, 5% of people have diabetes, 9% prediabetes, so total is 14%. In the US, of course, it's worse. 11% of people have diabetes, and roughly 1/3 have prediabetes, so total is in the 40s.
People with high blood pressure, people with some of these other conditions, they would be included in the 90-something percent, but I don't think that there is any compelling science for someone with hypertension, for example, to avoid oats. And we're going to touch specifically on the data if we
and I understand that you believe that. I would disagree with that, but I think they're both rational positions to hold. But it's different when you're the doctor in charge of the patient's care and you're seeing their CGM tracings and they're asking you questions. That makes it a little bit more binding in that scenario. Go ahead.
If the curve is abnormal, I agree there's an argument there. But yeah, so I think there we are reasonably clear. I just wanted to touch on a couple of the points that you made.
Sure.
This point about the nuance and that you're trying to kind of present the counterpoint to the exaggeration that oats are perfect and a panacea. I would gently suggest that your video doesn't come across that way. To me, it came across as an exaggeration in the other direction, that oats for everyone are going to be poison. In fact, you wrap up the video by saying oats are a terrible food for human beings.
My point is that oatmeal is a terrible food for human beings.
That's not nuance. That's not just American, just metabolically sick. That's a pretty clear categorical statement. So I'm not trying to give you a hard time. I'm just
I take your point, and I would reply that up until Quaker Oats, through their marketing campaign, painted oats as a healthy food for human beings, I think the vast majority of human beings would have agreed with my final statement that oats are a terrible food. You should only eat them if you're starving to death.
So this is a factual idea, and so going through the evidence is going to answer that, and we already started to. So just real quick to touch on a couple of things that you said. You brought up the uncertainty of science and these, I think you were referring to statistical adjustment models and multivariate adjustment models. There might be a misunderstanding. All the studies that I cited for hemoglobin A1C, they're all randomized trials. So these aren't epidemiological studies. This is taking the population, splitting them randomly, assigning oats to one of them. There is
to a mixed diet. You are adding oats to their diets, which is already a mixed diet.
Depends on the trial. In some cases, you're adding oats instead of another food. In some cases, you're adding. Depends on the exact design. But just wanted to clarify.
And so obviously, the people in that study, the other foods that they were eating would also have a tremendous effect on their blood sugar. And so I feel like the reason that the studies you're citing were actually designed and performed was because the researchers thought that oats were a magic food. They thought they were going to have some astounding effect. Why else would you waste research dollars saying, okay, I want you to eat them at your regular diet, but we're just going to add a bowl of oatmeal a day and see what that does? I mean, they're already eating 100 other foods, but adding a bowl of oatmeal it might make a difference that's slightly statistically significant, but that's not going to do anything to their overall health. Just adding a bowl of oatmeal, as in the converse argument, if everybody who watched my video, Gil, if it scared them and they're like, oh crap, oatmeal's poison, which I didn't say, by the way, but it's fine. And they stopped eating oatmeal. If all 2.5 million people who watched that video, if they stopped eating oatmeal and never ate oatmeal again for the rest of their life, it would not impact their health negatively at all. It would impact the profits for the Quaker Oat Company, but it would not impact those people's health at all if they never ate oatmeal again, because as you and I agreed, Oatmeal is not a magical food. It's not a superfood. It doesn't have any meaningful nutrition in it that you can't get from 1,000 other foods. It's just one of many thousands of choices on the supermarket aisle, correct?
You can remove oatmeal from a diet and still have a healthy diet, but it is not true that someone removing oatmeal necessarily is going to experience no difference or no detriment. It depends what they eat instead.
It does. You're right. Yeah, I agree. I totally agree.
We're going to cover more data. Hopefully we can get going through some of this stuff. Last thing, I just want to touch real quick on the funding. You brought up the funding. I did look at that because I suspected you were going to ask. There are plenty of studies that are funded by oat-related industries and plenty of studies that are not, that are independently funded. I took a look. There's no difference in kind of balance of evidence and direction of effect. It doesn't seem to.
And then I'm sure you would not mind if I tell your viewers that just because it wasn't officially funded by an oatmeal company doesn't mean that one or more of the researchers weren't being individually compensated by oatmeal companies. That's also a possibility that perhaps would not filter into the final disclosure at the end of the study.
Yeah, but we can hypothesize that in both directions. So
that's correct.
For example, in the studies comparing oats to eggs, all of those are funded by the egg board and by the egg industry. So I could look at that with a sort of a conspiratorial mindset and say, oh, so they wanted the eggs to look good. They looked about equivalent for most metrics except cholesterol. So the oats are probably better than eggs, and they just fudged the data. That's not
human nature. You know as well as I do that if you fund a study, you're not going to just completely make up the results, but you're going to want to have a little input into the results. And that goes for the egg board, the oatmeal lobby. Everybody does that. That's human nature. And again, one of the many reasons why I recommend that people don't just blindly trust any of the modern nutrition research. It needs to be tempered with common sense, and then also with the ample anthropological evidence of what people ate in the past. And so I would opine that if oats were somehow just over and above good for humans, they would have caught on and become very, very popular 4,000 years ago. And they would have just like in the wealthy would have been wanting to eat those oats. They would have not given those oats to the poor people. They would have taken those oats for themselves if there were any kind of objective, evidence that you could see with somebody's health. You would be like, oh no, look how healthy these poor people are. I'm going to take their oats away from them. And we, in fact, don't see any of that signal at all in the historical or the anthropological research. And so I'm glad that we agreed that oats are not a superfood. And I'm also glad that we agree that if you removed oats from your diet for the rest of your life, there would be no detrimental effects.
I don't entirely agree with that. But that's
okay.
We can agree to disagree on one. Yeah. Let me just.
I'm happy to tell me what would happen to somebody if they removed oats from their diet for the rest of their life. What negative health effects would they suffer from? What vitamin or mineral deficiency? What fatty acid or amino acid deficiency would they suffer from?
Outcomes. Yeah, we're going to go over more outcomes.
Okay. Now I've got a thing coming up at 1:15, Gil. I'm sorry, I didn't realize we've used quarter past the hour, but we got a few more minutes.
Okay. Let's see. What can I touch on? Have you seen any trial that raised hemoglobin A1C? Any randomized trial?
No, not in a mixed diet. I have not seen that.
Any diet?
Yeah. Well, I haven't. All the trials that I've seen where they added oatmeal or did some kind of oatmeal intervention, it was in the context that these people were eating other foods as well. And so, no, I haven't seen one that showed a discrete and meaningful elevation in A1C.
Yeah. So I would just suggest to you that since we have dozens of trials looking at A1C, they show either no difference or a reduction. Stating categorically that A1C is going to go up is strange to hold that belief. I think at least we should be cautious about that when the balance of evidence is categorically in the opposite direction. That's just my suggestion and how I go about it.
Yeah, no, I totally understand, and I appreciate your input.
Maybe, since we don't have a lot of time, maybe we can touch on blood pressure real quick because that's something that's come up.
Sure.
In the video, I'll try to go over this in 1 minute, and then I'll let you comment. In the video, the idea was Oats will increase your blood pressure. If you have hypertension and you start eating oatmeal every day, keep an eye on your blood pressure, it's probably going to go up. So we went over the evidence base. We found dozens of trials measuring. Just to clarify, some trials add oatmeal to the diet. Many other, they design entire diets, but the foods are similar for the two groups. It's the oats that are the variable. So the other foods are not a confounder when we observe a difference in an outcome. So I'll just finish this real quick. One meta-analysis of 21 randomized trials found an average a reduction of blood pressure on oats. This was explained by people who had high blood pressure at baseline or trials that compared it to refined grains. So when it's used in people with normal blood pressure, you tend to see no significant difference. Several trials look at, let me just conclude real quick.
Sure.
A couple of trials look at eggs versus oats. No significant effect on blood pressure on all of them that I've seen. The summary we found 27 trials, majority no significant difference on oats versus no oats, 3 or 4 a reduction. We couldn't find one outlier where the blood pressure went up. So my question is, have you seen any randomized trial where oats raised blood pressure?
So I haven't seen any trials that show that oatmeal raises blood pressure to any significant degree. And I'll explain to you what I mean in my video. Anytime you eat a food that causes a blood sugar excursion, that is going to cause a corresponding insulin elevation. And when you're eating, when you've seen that video and you think oatmeal, oh man, oatmeal is good for me, so I'm gonna have oatmeal for breakfast, then I'm gonna have oatmeal granola for snack, and then I'm gonna have an oat bar for lunch. And you're doing this constantly, you're going to wind up with something that many doctors don't know about, hyperinsulinemia. And one of the many things that hyperinsulinemia causes is it causes fluid retention. And this is why all the research came out saying, oh, salt will make your blood pressure go up. It is because in the context of hyperinsulinemia, yes, indeed, it will make it go up 2 or 3 points. That's what the research shows. But if you're constantly hyperinsulinemic from eating the oats, you're going to retain fluid. And so this is physiology, and it's also just mechanics. If you have more fluid in the system, your blood pressure is going to go up. That's just how the human body works. And so I'm not surprised that the randomized controlled trials and the meta-analysis of such don't show that. Back to my previous statement that it's almost impossible to do meaningful nutrition research. And I think the vast majority of modern nutrition research is junk. And that's why, because we know in human physiology, and I was a biologist before I was a doctor, so I was studying physiology before it was human physiology. It's just known how the mammalian body works. If you're hyperinsulinemic, you're going to retain fluid. If you retain fluid, your blood pressure is going to go up unless you're third spacing a ton of that fluid. And so it's a physiological principle that I was talking about there. I wasn't basing that on randomized controlled trials in nutrition research, which may or may not have been funded by somebody who had a vested interest in the outcome. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. There's an interesting thing that I would like to touch on, which is you had this idea based on physiology and then the conclusion that therefore blood pressure is going to go up. My question is, with 27 trials conducted, not one shows an increase in blood pressure. Don't you think that's a little strange to hold the belief that eating oatmeal is going to raise your blood pressure? Shouldn't we be able to see that in at least a couple of outliers?
Yeah, and I wish that I believed that modern nutrition research was the holy grail that many people think it is. I'll tell you this, Gil. I work with lots of different scientists in different genres. Nutrition research in humans, and this is not true for all nutrition research. If it's veterinary nutrition research for bovine or porcine or equine, they've got it down to a science. It is known what you should feed a goat or a cow or a pig. There's no question. But when it comes to human nutrition research, we don't know. We need more research.
So
human nutrition research. Well, let me finish this, and then I definitely will answer your question. Human nutrition research is looked at by other scientific disciplines as the stepchild of science. Like, everybody laughs at human nutrition research, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, because I've read a lot. I've read so much human nutrition research. I think there's some very good human nutrition research. I have Ansel Keys, the 3-volume set on his starvation studies. I've literally engulfed this stuff, but it's the laughingstock of scientific research, because it's just so uncontrollable. And when you find a tiny benefit or a tiny detriment, then you write up a paper, and then that becomes, oh, look, there's 21 trials that all show this same thing. And it's like, yeah, okay, I concede. You're right. That's what the modern nutrition research shows.
You don't think that if the problem was low quality, we would see a scatter? And when we see trials comparing eggs to oats, and we have at least 3 or 4 or 5 of these that I've seen, all funded by the Egg Board, and we don't see blood pressure go up on oats in one of these trials, you don't think that it's strange to hold the belief that oats will definitely raise our blood pressure, definitely, even though we don't have a single trial that will support that?
I don't know if I said definitely or not. I may have. I can't remember.
Oats will increase your blood pressure.
I'm sorry?
Oats will increase your blood pressure, is the quote from the video.
Yeah.
Actually, the original quote is longer. It says oats raise triglycerides, which will raise your insulin, which will raise your blood pressure. Then a little bit later, the video says if you already have high blood pressure, it'll probably go up more. So there's 2 statements. One, that it will raise blood pressure, and another, that it probably will.
And so I stand by the physiological principles that I used to make that video. I'm not surprised that the modern nutrition research disagrees with that. That really doesn't surprise me at all. But I base that on physiological principles, not modern nutrition research.
I'll make one last point, and then I'll let you conclude or make your final remarks, and then we'll wrap up. I know you have to go. The problem with the mechanistic argument is, like, for example, this will cause insulin to go up, this will cause liquid retention, blood pressure should go up, is we can always come up with a mechanism in any direction. In fact, with oats, we could come up with a mechanistic argument that has some support that would argue that the blood pressure would come down. For example, with beta glucan, that has been shown to have these types of effects.
Right.
So we could argue in any direction with any food. The way we know the net effect of all these mechanisms is by actually testing the health effect of a food in human beings, ideally in randomized trials, and doing it many times and seeing what the balance of evidence is. That's why that has more weight in hierarchy of evidence than speculating based on a mechanism. So I'll leave it at that.
I respect your opinion, Gil, and that's why what I would recommend to everybody watching this is make sure you have a good quality blood pressure cuff and try a dietary intervention and see what it does with your own personal physiology. Get a continuous glucose monitor and do your own dietary trial, because here's the beauty of that. You're 100% sure that there's no perverse incentive. There's nobody that's funded that study. That's just you and your data. And so you're not going to be misled by anybody if you do that. And I have great respect for Gil. I think he's doing great work. I've watched many of his YouTube videos. I don't want anybody watching this to think that in any way I was being disrespectful or negative. I think Gil's doing great work. And I have great hope for Gil, that because he is digging so deep into the research, and that also he's digging into the archaeology and anthropology. And I love that he's doing that, because what's going to happen is that Gil and I together on this journey, we're going to rediscover what the proper human diet actually is. And I've had many conversations like this, and then somebody come back 3, 5, 7 years later and say, wow, I did not realize. And so thanks so much, Gil, for having me on. I greatly appreciate it, this opportunity to be able to discuss this with you instead of you just doing a SmackDown video, which I know sometimes you can't help but do that if you can't get in contact with people. But I love your work, and I have great respect, and I appreciate you having me on.
I really thank you on behalf of the viewers and on my behalf for coming on and for having a great back and forth, very respectful and on our different views. And we went over the evidence on some topics. I had probably 10 times more data on other things that you brought up in the video, but of course we don't have time for everything. Maybe some other time we can go over.
Yeah, we'll do a round 2 in the future. Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay, quick summary of everything we talked about and my takeaways. We both agreed that paleoanthropology is a fascinating topic to learn about. We disagreed a bit on what role it plays for dietary decisions in 2024. Dr. Berry believes it is a central factor. I do not. I think it can give us ideas of things to test, but ultimately giving a food to a human being and observing and measuring the effect, for me, trumps any ancestor diet idea. We also agreed that in a normal, healthy individual, a glucose excursion or a glucose spike after a meal or after intense exercise is not a concern. It's normal physiology, at least up to a certain level, and that's an important takeaway. We disagreed on the exact cutoff where we start worrying. Dr. Berry worries if his glucose goes past 130 at any point. I don't. Based on the evidence I've seen, I am not worried if my glucose goes above 130, 140, 150, even higher after a meal, as long as by the 2-hour mark, it's not abnormal. If at any point it goes much higher, maybe 190 or 200, and it's not an isolated occurrence, I would look into it. Otherwise, glucose spike after a meal of 140, 150, even higher, normal physiology, I'm not worried. We also agreed that in individuals with abnormal glucose response, diabetes or prediabetes, pausing foods that cause abnormal spikes, abnormally high or abnormally long, can be a reasonable strategy. I'm even open to that argument for people with normal glucose response, but who have abnormal insulin response, people with insulin resistance, but who don't have prediabetes yet. An argument could be made there, as long as we don't lose sight of the number one priority, which is to fix the root cause, which in most people can be achieved with some weight loss. Dr. Berry also brought up undiagnosed diabetes, which is a great question. It's a real problem. It's rampant. Of course, we have to be consistent. There's a lot of undiagnosed diabetes, undiagnosed prediabetes, insulin resistance. There's also a lot of undiagnosed high blood pressure, hypercholesterolemia, and heart disease. So we got to find solutions that help people at every aspect of their health and not one metric in a vacuum. We also agreed that clarifying exaggeration has value. If influencers out there are saying that oats are a perfect food that solves every disease, explaining that for some people adding oats might be a good idea, for others pausing oats may make more sense. Provided we don't start doing the exact thing we're trying to fight. Influencers exaggerate to one side, so we go and we exaggerate to the other. The public is just confused. Person with diabetes, massive spikes on oats, so they switch to Greek yogurt and berries for breakfast instead. Reasonable strategy. Person with good glucose, but their cholesterol and their blood pressure are too high, so they add some oats and those metrics improve. Reasonable strategy. It doesn't have to be cookie cutter. We also disagreed on specific effects of oatmeal. For example, Dr. Berry is of the view that oatmeal will probably raise blood pressure. I searched systematically, and human trials, if anything, are pointing in the opposite direction. People with high blood pressure, oats may actually help reduce it. We also agreed that neither of us has seen a trial where blood pressure went up on oats, and we actually figured out why we have different views on some of these questions. This is the value of these conversations. It's not just opinion versus opinion. It's trying to understand what evidence each view sits on. Dr. Berry based his view on a physiological process. Higher insulin secretion should cause liquid retention, which should raise blood pressure. I tried to explain that this thought process will often get things wrong because we can always find another physiological process for any food that goes in any direction we want. In my view, it's the actual measurement in human beings after eating the food that is most likely to give us the correct answer. And since that has been done 27 times independently, for me, that's the most likely effect. Bear in mind that anecdotally, it's possible for me to drop my blood pressure, and yet I'm eating less oats than I used to. If a bunch of other things change, for example, if I lose weight, weight loss tends to improve blood pressure. So that doesn't mean it was reducing the oats that did it. This is why when we want to know the effect of one food, we run clinical trials where we have fewer variables. We also had slightly different views on the role of funding. In my opinion, funding concerns go both ways, although I think we ended up agreeing on that. So funding may skew one study in favor of oats, another study against oats. So what we do is we look at a number of studies done by different people, different funding sources, and we look for a consistent direction of effect. So that's what I tried to do. Same with research quality concerns, exactly the same logic. With an isolated study, absolutely, there could be a kink. Maybe one group ate some other food that skewed the results. Always possible. But by the time that we have dozens of studies looking at the same thing, finding a consistent direction of effect, and not one finds the thing that I thought was going to happen, I personally changed my views. And finally, Dr. Berry suggested that everybody keep an eye on their own blood pressure and blood work and their metrics, and I agree 100%. Overall, I think this was a fascinating conversation. I think anyone can learn something from this. I know I did. Should we do a part 2? Let me know below if you want to see it. There's lots of topics we didn't have time to touch on. Things like the effect of oats on body weight and nutrient absorption and satiety, lots of stuff. So let me know what you'd like to see. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.